Never trust a food that used to be locked up like gold. Sugar spent centuries behind counters, guarded like medicine, worth more than actual currency in some places, and paid for with more human suffering than almost any other product in history. And it's sitting right there in your coffee, completely unguarded, completely normal, completely forgotten. Today we're talking about sugar and how something that now costs a couple bucks a bag used to be one of the most controlled, most valuable, and most brutal substances on the planet. This isn't a story about a sweet treat. This is a story about doctors prescribing it like a drug, empires treating it like actual money, and an entire ocean turned into a highway for one of the darkest chapters in human history. By the end of this video, that sugar bowl on your counter is going to look completely different. Let's start with something that sounds almost impossible today. For most of history, sugar wasn't food, it was medicine. Sugar cane actually comes from New Guinea way back around 4,000 years ago, where people would just chew on the raw stalks for that sweet juice. From there, it slowly traveled to India, where people figured out how to crystallize it into something closer to what we'd recognize today. And when it eventually made its way west into the Arab world and later into Europe, doctors got their hands on it first. Physicians in the medieval Islamic world and later in Europe genuinely believed sugar had healing properties. It was used to treat everything from stomach problems to fevers, and it was sold in apothecaries right alongside other medicines, priced accordingly. If you wanted sugar in medieval Europe, you didn't go to a market stall. You went to a pharmacy. It sat on the same shelf as your other prescriptions, treated with the same seriousness, guarded with the same level of control. This tells you everything about how rare and valuable it actually was. This wasn't a spice you sprinkled on your food for fun. It was something you were given in small, careful doses because it cost a fortune and supply was painfully limited. So how did something locked away in a pharmacy end up dumped by the spoonful into your morning coffee? That transformation is where this story starts to get complicated and honestly a little dark. The turning point came with the Crusades. When Crusaders returned home from the Holy Land in the 12th century, they brought back stories of a strange, incredible substance they'd tasted in the Middle East. They didn't even really have a word for it. Chronicles from the time describe it as sweet salt, because sugar was so unfamiliar that the closest comparison they could make was to the one seasoning they already understood. And once European nobility got a taste of that sweet salt, the demand exploded. But here's the problem. Sugar cane doesn't grow just anywhere. It needs heat, it needs consistent moisture, and it needs a massive amount of manual labor to process, cutting the cane, crushing it, boiling the juice down for hours in brutal heat. Europe simply didn't have the climate or the labor system to produce it at scale on its own soil. So European powers went looking for land that did. Portuguese traders started growing sugar cane on Atlantic islands off the coast of Africa. Then it crossed the ocean entirely, planted across the Caribbean and along the coasts of the Americas. Sugar cane made it all the way to the colony of Jamestown in 1619. And it's worth pointing out that exact same year in that exact same colony is when the first enslaved Africans were brought to English North America. Those two events happening in the same year in the same place is not a coincidence you can ignore. It's basically the opening scene of everything that follows, because sugar cane cultivation needed an enormous, constant, physically brutal workforce, and European colonizers found what they considered the cheapest possible way to get it. First, they enslaved indigenous populations in the Americas. When disease and brutal conditions wiped out huge portions of those populations, colonizers turned to forced labor from Africa instead, and the scale of it is almost impossible to fully process. Historians estimate that over 12 million people were forcibly taken from sub-Saharan Africa between the 16th and 19th centuries, and a massive share of them were sent specifically to work on sugar plantations. On some Caribbean islands, up to 90% of enslaved people were working sugar, not cotton, not tobacco, sugar. This became known as the triangular trade, and it wasn't some side operation. It was one of the most organized, most profitable trade networks in human history. Ships left ports in places like Boston, Norfolk, and Charleston loaded with goods, sailed to the West African coast, traded those goods for human beings, then crossed the Atlantic in what's now called the Middle Passage, a journey so horrific that countless people didn't survive it. From there, those same ships picked up sugar and molasses in the Caribbean and carried it back to colonial America and Europe. And that molasses didn't just sweeten food, it got distilled into rum, which then got shipped right back to Africa to purchase more people. The entire cycle fed itself. And this wasn't a minor colonial side hustle. Sugar became one of the most valuable commodities on Earth. So valuable that it was genuinely treated like currency in some trade networks. Entire fortunes, entire empires were built and financed on sugar profits. That's part of why it earned the nickname white gold. It wasn't just profitable. In certain markets, it functioned almost like actual money, something you could trade, leverage, and build wealth on top of, the same way people used gold or silver. Even inside colonial America, sugar's economic weight was massive enough to help spark a revolution. In 1775, John Adams, who would later become the second president of the United States, wrote that people shouldn't be ashamed to admit that disputes over molasses played a real role in the lead up to the American Revolution. Taxes on sugar and molasses, things like the Sugar Act, passed by the British Parliament in 1764, genuinely angered American colonists and helped fuel the resentment that eventually exploded into war. Sugar wasn't just sweetening drinks in colonial America, it was quietly shaping the politics that would define the country's founding. So by this point, sugar has gone from a rare medicine to a form of wealth to the fuel behind one of history's cruelest trade systems, and even a factor in starting a war. You'd think demand would eventually slow down. It didn't. It exploded even further. In England, sugar consumption per person jumped from around 4 pounds a year in 1704 to roughly 90 pounds a year by 1901. That's not a small increase. That's more than a 20-fold jump in less than 2 centuries. And that surge happened largely because sugar became inseparable from 3 other products that were exploding in popularity at the exact same time: coffee, tea, and chocolate. All 3 of them are naturally bitter. Sugar is what made them enjoyable to drink by the cupful every single day. And once that habit locked in, there was no going back. That massive demand eventually collided with a political crisis. And it's honestly one of the stranger turning points in this whole story. In the early 1800s, during the Napoleonic Wars, the British Navy blockaded French ports, cutting France off from its usual sugar supply coming from Caribbean colonies. Napoleon needed a solution fast, so he threw enormous investment into an alternative source growing right there on European soil: sugar beets. Almost 80,000 acres of beet farms and hundreds of small refineries opened up in France within just a few years. That single wartime decision is the reason sugar beet farming became a permanent, massive industry across Europe, one that still exists today. All because a blockade forced a war strategy into what was essentially an agricultural workaround. Meanwhile, back across the Atlantic, the abolitionist movement was gaining real momentum, partly fueled by boycotts, specifically targeting sugar produced by enslaved labor. Britain formally abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in the British colonies in 1833. But sugar production didn't stop, and neither did the exploitation behind it. Plantation owners simply shifted to a new source of cheap labor: indentured workers brought over from India, China, and other parts of Asia under contracts that were often barely different from slavery in practice. The system adapted, the suffering didn't disappear, it just changed shape. Even after all of that, sugar kept working its way deeper and deeper into everyday life, until it stopped being a luxury item entirely and became something almost invisible. By the late 1800s, sugar was cheap enough that ordinary working-class households were spreading it on bread as jam, something that would have been unthinkable for a medieval peasant who could never have dreamed of touching something that used to sit behind a pharmacy counter. In 1886, a chemist in Atlanta named John Pemberton had to reformulate a popular tonic after new prohibition laws in the city banned alcohol. He swapped the alcohol out for a 15% sugar syrup instead. That reformulated drink eventually became Coca-Cola, one of the most recognized products on the entire planet, and its very existence traces directly back to sugar filling in for something else. In the 1840s, a woman in a sugar-producing region of Central Europe cut her finger badly while trying to chop off a piece from a giant cone of raw sugar, which is how sugar was commonly sold and stored at the time. Her husband ran a sugar refinery, and after watching her get hurt, he built a machine specifically designed to press sugar into small, safe, uniform little cubes instead. That's the exact origin of the sugar cube sitting in your kitchen right now, invented because of a kitchen accident involving a giant dangerous block of sugar. So think about the full journey here. Sugar started out locked in a pharmacy, treated as medicine too rare and too valuable for ordinary people to touch. It became something so profitable, it functioned almost like actual currency, financing fortunes and empires. It became the engine behind one of the largest forced migrations of human beings in history, a system built entirely on the suffering of millions of people who never chose to be part of it. And it eventually became so normal, so cheap, and so completely woven into daily life that most of us pour it into our coffee without thinking about any of this for even a second. That's the strange, uncomfortable truth about sugar. The most ordinary item in your kitchen carries one of the heaviest histories of anything you'll ever consume. Every spoonful is quietly connected to pharmacies, empires, revolutions, and an ocean crossed by ships carrying almost unimaginable suffering. So next time you're stirring sugar into your coffee or your tea, take half a second and think about just how far that spoonful actually traveled to get there and what it cost along the way. What surprised you the most in this video? The medicine part, the currency part, or the blood behind it? Let me know in the comments. And if you like uncovering the real history hiding behind everyday things, hit subscribe.